What if one stranger could mend a broken world? A failing farm, a grieving man, and a woman cast aside, until danger forged them into something unstoppable. The wind roared across the dry, fractured earth, hurling dust into the air like a wild, invisible beast clawing at the emptiness. Mr. Harlan stood on the sagging porch of his worn-out cabin, his rough hands gripping the splintered railing so tight his knuckles whitened. He stared out at the horizon, where the sun dipped low, brushing the sky with bold streaks of gold and crimson that seemed to mock the bleakness below. Evenings like this sank deep into him. The silence stretched so wide and heavy it felt like it could pull him into a dark pit he'd never escape. A loose floorboard groaned under his weight, jolting him back, and then came his son's small, eager voice. "Huh, is dinner ready yet?" Hawk's blonde hair stuck out in messy, wind-blown tufts, his cheeks smudged with dirt from hours spent tumbling near the chicken coop. Mr. Harlan forced a thin smile, though it stayed shallow, never reaching the hollows of his eyes. "Soon, son. Just gotta check the traps first." He looked down at the boy, so full of life and light, even after all they'd endured. Hawk was his last tether, the only thing keeping him from drifting into the void of his own despair. 2 years had crawled by since Margaret, his wife, slipped away from him. A fever had swept through town like a thief in the night, ruthless and swift, stealing her breath and leaving Mr. Harlan with nothing but memories. He'd buried her on the hill behind the cabin, beneath a willow tree whose drooping branches swayed in the breeze, as if they carried her sorrow alongside his own. He'd fought to hold the farm together since then, but it was breaking apart long before she fell ill. The livestock dwindled, one animal after another succumbing to hunger or disease. The crops shriveled more often than they thrived, and the endless drought baked the soil into brittle, useless dust. He scratched out a living with odd jobs in town, breaking wild horses until his hands bled, mending fences for men whose barns overflowed with grain, but the coins he pocketed barely kept bread on the table. He rarely went into town anymore. People had been kind when Margaret was sick, bringing broth and murmured prayers, but their goodwill soured when he couldn't shake the darkness that clung to him. He saw it in their eyes, pity hardening into impatience, then disdain. Mr. Harlan, once the loudest laugh in the saloon, cracking jokes over warm beer, was now a gaunt shadow, worn thin by grief and the grind of survival. His boots crunched against the gravel as he trudged toward the traps he'd set along the edge of his land. His rifle hung heavy over his shoulder, a familiar weight he carried more out of habit than necessity. Coyotes didn't respect property lines, slinking through the dust to snatch what little he had left, and neither did the debt collectors who'd soon come hammering at his door if he didn't scrape together the money he owed. The traps gave him 2 scrawny rabbits, their thin frames a stark sign of how stingy the land had become. He hauled them back to the cabin, lit a fire in the hearth with trembling hands, and roasted them over the flickering flames. The smell of charred meat filled the small, dusty room, mixing with the stale air that seemed to cling to everything. Huck ate with gusto, his chatter spilling out between bites. Wild tales of cowboys riding across the plains, outlaws lurking in the shadows, all spawned from his boundless imagination. Mr. Harlan nodded along, offering grunts of acknowledgement, his mind drifting to places he couldn't quite name. That night, as Huck drifted off under a patched, threadbare blanket, Mr. Harlan sat by the fire, staring into the dying embers. Margaret's absence was a dull, constant ache, a pain that had carved itself into his bones like an old scar. The thought of finding someone new twisted in his gut like a betrayal, but the loneliness pressed harder every day, a weight he wasn't sure he could bear much longer. A sharp, insistent knock startled him awake. He hadn't even noticed he'd slipped into a doze. The sky outside was still pitch black, shadows thick and unyielding, the sun hours from rising. Hawk stirred on his cot, but didn't wake, his breathing soft and even in the quiet. Mr. Harlan opened the door to find Old Man Higgins standing there, his gray beard speckled with dust, his tattered hat pulled low over his weathered face. Higgins ran the livery in town and had a nose for everyone's business, whether they invited him in or not. "Harlan," he rasped, his voice rough as broken glass. "You better get down to the station. Something's brewing, and it's a sight." Mr. Harlan's brow furrowed, suspicion tightening his chest. "What's it got to do with me?" Higgins scratched at his chin, his eyes glinting in the faint glow of the lantern he carried. A bride rolled in on the morning train. Her man never showed, left her stranded there on the platform. Folks are stirring up trouble, being their usual gracious selves. Mr. Harlan's jaw clenched, his voice tight with doubt. "Why come to me about it?" "'Cause you ain't like the rest of them," Higgins said, his tone steady. "And I figure you'll want to see this for yourself before it gets uglier." Curiosity gnawed at Mr. Harlan, tangled with a reluctant pull of duty he couldn't shake. He grabbed his coat, the fabric stiff with age, and stepped out into the cold, leaving Hawk asleep in the cabin. The train station was just a rickety wooden platform and a shack where the station master kept schedules and sorted freight, its walls weathered by years of wind and neglect. A small crowd had gathered, their voices rising with sharp, cruel laughter that cut through the morning chill. Then he saw her, Martha Bell. She stood near her trunks, shoulders hunched like she was bracing against a storm that wouldn't let up. She was big, no denying it, but it wasn't just her size that caught his eye. There was a solidity to her, a quiet, unyielding strength that made Mr. Harlan feel small and hollow by comparison. Too fat for her own good, someone sneered from the crowd. "Can't believe any man would want her. She'll eat him out of house and home." Another jeered, spitting tobacco into the dust with a wet smack. Martha kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but Mr. Harlan saw the hurt flash in her eyes, sharp and raw, like an open wound she couldn't cover. He stood there for a long moment, torn between walking away and stepping in. The venom in their voices lit a spark in him, anger at their meanness, maybe a flicker of something decent he'd thought he'd lost. He cleared his throat, loud enough to turn heads. "What's the trouble here?" The crowd shifted, their eyes narrowing as they recognized him. Mr. Harlan wasn't one for meddling in other folks' messes. He kept to himself these days, but he couldn't bring himself to turn back this time. "No trouble, Harlan," Higgins called from somewhere in the throng, his voice casual but edged. "Just a woman waiting for a man who ain't ever coming." Martha's eyes met his, defiance barely masking the pain shimmering beneath. "Were you planning on going?" Mr. Harlan asked, ignoring the whispers and snickers rippling through the group. Her voice came strong, though it trembled under the surface. "I was promised a place here, a fresh start. Seems I was a lie." He nodded slowly, taking her in. "And you've got nowhere else to go?" "Not a single damn place," she admitted, her shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of her own words. Mr. Harlan scratched at his beard, feeling the crowd's stares burn into him like hot irons. He didn't owe this woman anything. Hell, he could barely keep himself and Hawk fed, let alone take on someone else's troubles. But something about her, the way she stood tall despite their scorn, the stubborn set of her jaw, stirred an old instinct in him, one he hadn't felt in years. "I've got a place," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, surprising even himself. "It's run down, but you're welcome to stay until you figure your next move." Her eyes widened with shock, then narrowed with suspicion, searching his face for a trick. "Why would you do that?" Mr. Harlan shrugged, keeping it simple. "'Cause I know what it's like to have nowhere left to turn." Higgins chuckled from behind him, a dry, raspy sound. "Well, ain't that a sight?" Mr. Harlan taking it astray. The crowd began to disperse, their interest fading now that the spectacle had lost its bite. Martha looked at Mr. Harlan a moment longer, her gaze probing for any hint of cruelty or deceit. Finding none, she nodded, her voice steadier than before. I thank you, Mr. Harlan. Truly. It's just Harlan, he replied, grabbing one of her trunks, a heavy, battered thing, and hefting it over his shoulder. Come on. Best we get moving before the sun climbs too high and cooks us both. They walked away from the station, her steps heavy but determined beside him, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound for a while. As they went, Mr. Harlan felt something shift inside him, a faint warmth creeping through the cracks of his loneliness, fragile but real. He couldn't name it yet, but it was enough to keep him putting one foot in front of the other. Martha's first morning at the Harlan homestead began with the shrill crow of roosters piercing the dawn and the acrid smell of coffee boiling over a weak, sputtering fire. The cabin was small, its walls thin and patched with age, the floorboards creaking loudly under her every step. She'd slept poorly on the lumpy cot Mr. Harlan had set up for her in the corner, the uneven stuffing poking at her back through the night, but it only hardened her determination. The place was in a sorry state, worse than she'd imagined when she'd agreed to come. But she'd seen worse in her life, places where hope had long since dried up and blown away. Mr. Harlan moved through his morning chores like a man driven by something he couldn't outrun, his motions quick and efficient, his face a mask she couldn't read. She saw the exhaustion stamped deep into his features, the gauntness from too many missed meals, the shadows under his eyes from nights spent staring at nothing. But beneath that gruff exterior, she sensed something softer, something he guarded as fiercely as a man might protect his last dollar. Hawk greeted her with a wide, gap-toothed grin, his enthusiasm bursting out despite the early hour. "You going to be staying, Miss Martha?" he asked, clutching a wooden toy horse he'd whittled from a scrap of wood, its edges rough but proud. "For a while, I reckon," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Long as your pa's willing to have me around." Hawk's smile stretched wider. "I like you here. Pa don't laugh much anymore, but you made him smile. I saw it last night when you talked to him." Martha's cheeks warmed at that, a flush she couldn't hide. She didn't know what to say, so she turned to the mess around her, looking for something useful to do. By midday, Martha had worked tirelessly, sweeping, scrubbing, and mending Hawk's shirt, all to distract from the anxiety gnawing at her. When Harlan returned, she had a simple meal ready. His surprise was brief, but his quiet appreciation spoke volumes. After dinner, Harlan showed her the farm's worn-out buildings, a place barely hanging on but full of rugged charm. Hawk believed she could help fix it, calling her strong and smart. Martha smiled, though old pain flickered within and ruffled his hair. "Maybe you're right, kid." The days that followed melted into a haze of sweat, sore muscles, and the steady rhythm of work. Martha threw herself into whatever tasks Mr. Harlan let her take on, mending fences with rusty wire she found in the barn, clearing rocks and brittle weeds from the fields until her palms blistered, digging a shallow trench along the barn's edge to keep rainwater from pooling when the rare storms rolled through. He watched her progress from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his silence softened over time, less cold and more curious. Every evening, she cooked supper, simple fare scraped together from their dwindling stores, and sat with Mr. Harlan and Hawk around the rough-hewn table, its surface scarred from years of use. Conversation stayed thin, words doled out sparingly, but the air grew warmer, less strained with each meal. Hawk chattered on about his day, adventures with the chickens, dreams of riding wild horses across the plains, his voice a bright thread in the quiet. Mr. Harlan listened, nodding here and there, though his eyes often drifted to Martha, his brow creased like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Word of her presence spread fast through town, carried on whispers and wagging tongues, and not all of it was kind. When Mr. Harlan rode in for supplies one afternoon, he came back with a clenched jaw and a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. "Caleb Dunham's been talking," he told her that night, his voice low and taut as he stood by the hearth. "Claims you're some witch, putting spells on me and Hawk. Saw you fixing the fences and swears it's unnatural. says no woman should work that fast or that hard. Martha's fingers tightened around the spoon she was stirring the stew with, the wood digging into her palm. He believed that nonsense, or just stirring trouble. Caleb's always stirring trouble, Mr. Harlan replied, his tone sharp as a blade. Man's had a grudge against me since I refused to sell him this land years ago. Now it's falling to pieces. He thinks he can scare me off, and you're his new excuse. Let him think what he wants. Martha said, her voice firm despite the knot in her gut. I ain't afraid of him. Mr. Harlan's gaze turned piercing, his expression harder than she'd seen it before. That's easy to say now, Martha. Caleb's got money and men, more than you or me combined. Money don't make a man strong, she shot back, meeting his stare. And it sure don't make him right. Mr. Harlan grunted, a rough sound, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like respect, though he'd never admit it outright. Maybe so, but I'd be a damn fool if I didn't keep my guard up. They kept working side by side, often in silence, but it was a silence that settled into something comfortable, almost companionable. Martha found a quiet satisfaction in the labor. The stubborn soil, the dull tools, the way her hands grew rough and calloused with every task. She laughed more, her voice startling the still air around the cabin, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. Hawk's antics brought smiles from her, his boyish exuberance infectious as he darted around the homestead. Mr. Harlan softened too, though he hid it behind his gruff demeanor, his edges worn down by time and necessity. She caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze distant and thoughtful, like he was trying to piece together what she was made of. The nights grew colder, the wind whistling through the cabin's thin walls, but the space felt warmer somehow, as if her presence had stoked an old fire back to life, faint but growing. Trouble came sneaking in one frigid morning, though, just passed on, when the world was still cloaked in frost and shadow. Martha woke to the sound of hoofbeats pounding the frozen ground, a rumble that grew louder and more menacing with every second. She yanked on her coat, the fabric stiff and cold against her skin, and stumbled outside, her breath fogging in the sharp air. A group of riders thundered up the path toward the cabin, Caleb Dunham at the front, his face twisted into a sneer that promised nothing but grief. Harlan! Caleb's voice cracked through the chill like a gunshot. I've come for what's mine. Mr. Harlan stepped out from the cabin, rifle in hand but pointed low, his shoulders braced like a man ready for war. You got nothing here, Caleb. Go back to town and leave us be. I've got claims that say otherwise, Caleb snapped, holding up a rolled parchment, its edges curling in the wind. You've been squatting on this land long enough. Either pay up or get out. And that woman you took in, she's got the devil's hand. Folks seen her working your fields like a man possessed. That ain't natural, and it sure as hell ain't right. Martha stepped forward, her voice steady despite the cold. I work because it needs doing. If you're scared of a woman doing a man's job, maybe you're the one who's unnatural. Caleb threatened her, but Mr. Harlan's voice was cold and firm. If you step on my land again, Caleb, you'll regret it. Caleb laughed, hollow and empty, before leaving with his men. Martha, startled by Harlan's protective stance, whispered, You didn't have to defend me. His reply was simple and heavy. Yes, I did. The weeks that followed were a tense, exhausting blur of labor and fleeting moments of something like peace. Martha threw herself into the work with a determination that teetered on desperate, mending fences with whatever wire she could scrounge, patching the barn's roof where the wind had torn shingles loose, clearing rocks and dead brush from the fields so the soil might breathe again if rain ever came. Her muscles burned with the effort, her hands growing rough and calloused, the pain a welcome distraction from the fear that gnawed at her insides. She'd come here for a new beginning, not to drag trouble to Mr. Harlan's doorstep, and she'd prove she was worth more than the pity he'd shown by taking her in. Mr. Harlan watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression often unreadable, but his silence no longer felt like a rebuke. It was quieter, more thoughtful. She caught him staring on more than one occasion, his gaze curious and calculating, like he was trying to unravel what kept her going. Beneath it, though, she saw something softer, a warmth he buried deep under the armor of his tough exterior, a flicker of something human he didn't let show often. Hawk was her greatest joy in those days. The boy took to her like she'd always been part of their little world, trailing her around the homestead with an energy she envied and couldn't help but admire. He peppered her with questions as she worked, his curiosity a bottomless well. "How'd you learn to mend fences so quick?" he asked one afternoon, perched on a stump as she pounded nails into the splintered wood of the goat pen. "Back home, my folks had a farm," she told him, her voice steady despite the ache in her arms and the sweat stinging her eyes. "When my brother died, there wasn't anyone else to do the work. So I learned, had to figure out fast." Hawk's eyes widened, bright with wonder. "But you're a lady. Ain't ladies supposed to wear dresses and sit all pretty, doing needlework or something?" Martha laughed, the sound deep and rolling like thunder over the plains, startling a goat into bleating. "Some do, sure, but I never much cared for sitting around. I like keeping my hands busy, always have." "You sound like Pa," Hawk said, his voice turning solemn, almost wise beyond his years. "He don't sit much neither, not unless he's too tired to move, and even then he don't like it." She glanced over her shoulder toward the cabin, where Mr. Harlan was wrestling with a busted porch step, his shirt damp with sweat. "Your pa works hard 'cause he loves you," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Everything he does, every fence he fixes, every trap he sets, is to make sure you've got what you need." Hawk nodded, but a shadow crossed his face, too heavy for a kid his age. He didn't talk about his mother often, but Martha caught him staring at the willow on the hill more than once, his small features drawn tight with a sadness that didn't fit his bright spirit. She tried to lighten his load with stories, wild tales of knights in shining armor, dragons breathing fire, spun for her imagination as they gathered eggs from the coop or scrubbed clothes in the creek's sluggish current. Hawk drank them in, his laughter brightening the air like sunlight piercing through storm clouds, a sound that lifted her own heart more than she'd expected. He'd run to Mr. Harlan, breathless with excitement, retelling her latest yarn with all the fervor of a preacher delivering a sermon, his hands waving as he acted out the best parts. Mr. Harlan's reactions shifted day by day. Sometimes he'd grunt in acknowledgement, his focus fixed on whatever task lay before him, sawing wood or sharpening a blade. Other times, a smile would flicker across his lips, so brief and fragile Martha wondered if she'd only imagined it. She saw how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering with a mix of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite pin down. Martha tried not to dwell on the warmth growing in her chest when she caught those looks. It was foolish to imagine anything more than what they had, a tenuous alliance built on necessity and shared hardship. Mr. Harlan hadn't made promises, hadn't offered reassurances beyond his grudging acceptance of her presence. But the way he treated her, his careful consideration, even when his words were clipped and brusque, kept a quiet hope alive in her, stubborn as a weed pushing through cracked earth. Nights in the cramped cabin brought them closer in a way she hadn't seen coming. She lay awake on the narrow cot Mr. Harlan had set up for her, the room so small their lives felt knotted together, suffocating at times, but strangely comforting too. She could hear Mr. Harlan's breathing in the darkness, steady and deep like the rhythm of the land itself, and Hawk's occasional murmurs as he dreamed of horses galloping free and heroes slaying monsters. It was a kind of intimacy she'd never known, the quiet harmony of living alongside others, not just existing in their shadows. Trouble came knocking again, though, and it wasn't subtle this time. Caleb's men started their harassment, leaving dead rabbits by the creek, their bodies stiff and cold, scratching threats into the barn's weathered wood with a knife's edge, shouting jeers about her size and supposed witchcraft whenever they caught her hauling water or hammering nails. "You ain't safe here, woman," one of them sneered one afternoon as she lugged a bucket up from the well, the water sloshing against her boots. "Best leave before things get ugly, real ugly." Martha met his gaze with a steadiness that sent a chill down his spine, her voice calm but iron hard. "I've dealt with uglier men than you, and I'm still standing. Get off this land before I decide to chase you off myself." He grumbled and backed away, spitting into the dirt as he went, but her heart pounded with anger and a darker thread of dread. She'd come here for a fresh start, a chance to build something new, but it seemed trouble had tracked her down like a hound on a scent. Mr. Harlan found the wreckage one morning. A section of fence torn apart, splintered posts scattered like bones, and half the cattle driven off into the wild beyond the property's edge. His fury was a palpable thing, a storm brewing in his chest as he spoke to Martha before saddling his horse. "I'm going to end this," he said, his eyes like flint, hard and unyielding. "Caleb's gone too far, stealing livestock, vandalizing the barn. He wants me to break, but I won't give him the satisfaction of seeing me fold." "Maybe I should go," Martha offered, her voice strained, the words heavy on her tongue. "If it's me he's after, I won't bring more harm to you or Hawk." Mr. Harlan's gaze softened, his shoulders easing as if her suggestion had wounded him. "This ain't your fault, Martha. Caleb's been trying to force me off this land long before you ever showed up. You've been a help to me, to Hawk, and I won't have you running off because of some coward schemes." "Then let me help you fight," she said, her voice fierce, a fire flaring in her chest. "You can't do it alone, and neither can I. We're in this together now." His lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, faint but real. "You've got more fight in you than most men I've met. Reckon I could use the help. Reckon I need it." They spent the following days preparing, reinforcing the fences with fresh-cut wood, setting traps around the perimeter with wire and cunning, stockpiling what little supplies they could afford from town. Martha's strength proved invaluable. Her ability to haul lumber, swing a hammer, and wrestle the land into submission impressed even Mr. Harlan, though he'd never say it outright. Their conversations grew more frequent, their silences less fraught with unease, a fragile trust taking root between them. Hawk remained blissfully unaware of the danger hovering like a storm cloud over their little homestead, his laughter ringing out over the fields, a stubborn defiance against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of hauling rocks and mending posts, Martha sat beside Mr. Harlan on the porch, their legs dangling over the edge, boots brushing the dirt below. The sky had turned a deep, velvety blue, stars shimmering like jewels scattered across dark silk. The air was crisp, a cool breeze rustling the leaves of the willow tree on the hill, its branches whispering secrets to the night. "You don't have to stare, you know," Mr. Harlan said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost didn't catch it over the wind. Martha glanced at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hands resting heavy on his knees. "But I can't ask you to stay either. Not when there's so much risk, so much that could go wrong." "You're not asking me to stay," she said, her voice lowering, steady but soft. "I chose to. And not just because I've got nowhere else to go. I chose this, you Hawk." His eyes met hers then, something raw and vulnerable flickering in their depths, a crack in a wall he'd built around himself. "You've made things better around here," he said, the words rough but honest. "The work, the food, Hawk. He's happier with you around, brighter than I've seen him in a long time. And so am I, even if I don't say it right." Martha's breath hitched, her heart thundering in her chest, loud enough she feared he'd hear it. "Then I'll stay," she whispered, barely audible over the breeze. "As long as you'll have me." The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the air sharp enough to cut through cloth and skin alike. Martha woke to the sound of hoofbeats echoing against the frost-hardened earth, their rhythm urgent and relentless, a warning she couldn't ignore. She rose from her cot, her bones creaking from another sleepless night, and pulled on her boots, the leather stiff against her feet. Mr. Harlan had been clear. Caleb wouldn't rest until the Harlans were driven from their land, and Martha's presence had only added fuel to his spiteful fire. She stepped outside to find Mr. Harlan already saddling his horse, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes darkened by an exhaustion that seemed to hollow him out. Hawk hovered nearby, clutching his wooden horse with knuckles turned white from the cold, his small face pinched with worry he didn't fully understand. "What's happening?" Martha asked, her voice rough from disuse, scraping against the quiet. Caleb's men hit again, Mr. Harlan growled, his fury barely contained, a snarl in his throat. Tore down the fences, drove the cattle off, left tracks clear as day, like they're daring me to come after them. Martha's fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. "You can't keep going after them alone, Harlan. They'll kill you if you push them too far. They've got no mercy in them. Better to die fighting than let that bastard steal what's mine." Mr. Harlan snapped, though his anger wasn't truly aimed at her. It was bigger than that, a beast he couldn't tame. "I'll head out and see if I can catch them before they hit the river. I won't let this stand." "I'm coming with you," she said, the words spilling out before she'd fully weighed them. But there was no mistaking her resolve, hard as the frozen ground beneath her. Mr. Harlan turned to face her, his eyes narrowing, a storm brewing behind him. "You'll do no such thing. This is my fight, Martha." "It's ours," she corrected, her voice firm, unyielding. "You said I've been a help to you. Well, let me help you now. We can't keep playing defense while Caleb tears this place apart piece by piece." Harlan stared at Martha, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded, tense. "Stay behind me, and if anything goes wrong, you get out. Understand?" Martha met his gaze with determination. "I'm not running, Harlan. Not from this, or from you." They rode out together, the cold biting at their skin, following the trail of broken fences. They found the cattle near the river, surrounded by Caleb's men. One of them mocked. "Looks like Harlan brought a bodyguard." Martha dismounted, steady despite the cold. "You boys better walk away before I teach you a lesson." The taller man stepped forward, threatening her, but Harlan's voice cut through, cold and menacing. "Touch her, and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt." The second man raised his rifle quickly, but Martha fired first, the shotgun blast knocking him down. Harlan shot the taller man, sending him sprawling. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Martha's hands trembled as she looked at Harlan, who nodded on his eyes. "Damn, Martha, you saved my life." She swallowed, the weight of it settling in. Had to be done. They gathered the cattle in silence, the ride back tense, Martha's mind replaying the moment over and over. When they reached the cabin, Hawk ran out to meet them, his small frame bouncing with a mix of relief and confusion, his eyes wide and searching. "Did you catch the bad men?" he asked, his voice small and brittle, clutching his wooden horse like a shield. Mr. Harlan nodded, his tone gentle despite the hardness still lingering in his face. "We did, son. They won't be bothering us anymore. Not those two." Hawk looked to Martha, his gaze darting over her, sharp for a boy so young. "Are you hurt, Miss Martha?" "No, Hawk," she said, forcing a smile that felt flimsy, a lie she couldn't quite sell. "Just tired, real tired." Her legs wobbled as she slid from the horse, but she hid the tremors from Hawk's watchful eyes, not wanting him to see the cracks. The days that followed were tense and restless, filled with the work of preparation, rebuilding the fences with fresh-cut posts, stockpiling ammunition in case more trouble came, securing the barn against further sabotage with boards and nails driven deep. Caleb's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud, his influence seeping into the town like a sickness, turning neighbors into strangers. The folks in town grew distant. Their eyes slid away from Martha, Whenever she ventured into the general store or the post office, their whispers trailing her like a bitter wind. She bore the scorn with as much dignity as she could muster, her head high, but the weight of it grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on her shoulders like a yoke. Mr. Harlan remained steadfast, his loyalty unshaken by the gossip that swirled around them, a quiet strength she leaned on more than she'd admit. Their evenings together on the porch grew longer, their conversations stretching out, less guarded with every word shared. "Margaret'd have liked you," Mr. Harlan said one night, his gaze fixed on the stars twinkling above, his voice thick with the ache of memory. "You've got the same fire she did, the same damn determination to keep going no matter how hard the world tries to break you." "I'm not trying to replace her," Martha whispered, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, the fabric of her skirt worn thin. "I know," he said, shaking his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "And that's what makes it matter. You're here because you choose to be, not because anyone asked you to." The moment stretched out between them, raw and exposed, a fragile thread connecting them. Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes, hot and insistent. But she held them back. She couldn't afford a crack, not when the world seemed so determined to see her fall. The final confrontation came 3 days later, swift and merciless. Caleb Dunham and his men rode onto the property at dawn, rifles drawn, cruelty etched into their weathered faces like scars. Martha stood beside Mr. Harlan, her shotgun clutched tight in her hands, her heart pounding a fierce rhythm against her ribs. This time, there'd be no retreat, no negotiation, just a raw edge of survival. The gunfire erupted like a storm, deafening and relentless, a chaos of sound and smoke that blurred her vision and set her ears ringing. She fired until her arms ached, her shots steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Caleb's men fell one by one, their arrogance undone by desperation, their bodies crumpling to the frost-dusted ground. Caleb himself was the last to go, his eyes wide with disbelief as Mr. Harlan's bullet tore through him, a final, fatal strike that ended the threat once and for all. When the dust settled, Martha stood trembling but unbroken, her breath ragged, her hands still gripping the gun like a lifeline. Mr. Harlan stepped close, pulling her into his arms, his embrace fierce and unyielding, a warmth that anchored her in the chaos. The land was theirs, finally completely, won through blood and grit. And as she leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers, she knew she'd found something worth fighting for, something worth holding onto with everything she had. A fight for a home turned into a fight for each other, a bond forged in fire and dust. Their stories done here. Subscribe for more tales like this.